Welcome. We appreciate you joining us today. Got a podcast today that is going to focus in, as you can see from the slide, to the year 1844. In fact, the entire presentation today will be just a few months into the year of 1844. In our last segment here that we've entitled The Passport to Heaven. On May 8th, 1844, the prophet found himself in court again, as usual. He was tried on a complaint by Francis Higbee for damages of $5,000. That was an astronomical amount of money at that time, and no explanation was given as to what the charges were. At the conclusion of the trial, the judge discharged Joseph and said, and I quote, "The court is convinced that this suit was instituted through malice, through private pique and corruption, and ought not to be contravened. And it is ordered that the cost of the court, should be paid by Francis M. Higbee." Now, this slide's kind of interesting. Brigham Young said that I know for myself that Joseph Smith was subject to 48 lawsuits, and most of them I witnessed with my own eyes. But not one action could ever be made to bear against him. No law or constitutional right did he ever violate. He was innocent and virtuous. He kept the laws of his country and lived above it. Out of the 48 lawsuits, and I was with him in most of them, not one charge could be substantiated against him. The story of Joseph's life. Well, the next day, a court-martial was held for Major General Wilson Law for ungentlemanly and unofficer-like conduct in the seduction of a parentless young girl. The charge was sustained, and Wilson Law was cashiered, meaning he was released or court-martialed. A court-martial was then held for Robert D. Foster, Surgeon General, for unbecoming and unofficer-like conduct as well. The charge was also sustained, and Robert Foster was cashiered. This particular slide, I have a signature letter in my custody that is signed by Joseph Smith asking Charles C. Rich to attend this particular court-martial with Wilson Law. Just thought I'd share that with you. On May the 17th, a state convention was held in Nauvoo. General Joseph Smith was nominated as a candidate for President of the United States, with Sidney Rigdon from Pennsylvania as Vice President. It was resolved that a national convention would be held in Baltimore on Saturday, July 13th. On May 18th, the final steps were taken to rid the church of the apostates. Francis M. Higbee, Charles Ivan, and Austin Cowles were excommunicated for apostasy. Joseph continued, however, to be harassed on every side by these kinds of individuals. Francis Higbee took his case against Joseph to Carthage in an effort to have him summoned to Carthage, but Joseph was not going to leave the friendly confines of Nauvoo. By mid-May, Joseph was focusing on two things: evading arresting officers and his political campaign. Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, Lyman White, and about 100 other elders left Nauvoo on political missions to the east in an effort to promote the cause of Joseph's presidency. On May 23rd, in Carthage, William Law swore out a complaint on adultery and polygamy against the prophet. Francis Higbee also swore before a grand jury that Joseph had received stolen property, and Dr. Robert Foster had sworn a charge of perjury against Joseph relative to a case involving a fellow named Simpson. Carthage had now become the melting pot for bringing all charges up against the leadership of the church. Police were put on guard in the city. The outlaw, Joseph H. Jackson, was seen lurking around Nauvoo. He had threatened to take the prophet's life if he had an opportunity. The High Council of Nauvoo published in The Neighbor the affidavits of 4 young women who testified that Chauncey Higbee brought about their ruin by deceit in representing that Joseph Smith taught that promiscuous sexual relations were not sinful if they were kept secret. On Monday, May the 27th, Joseph decided to go to Carthage and face the indictments drawn up against him and confront his enemies. He took 20 close friends with him as bodyguards. Surprisingly, Charles Foster overtook the party a few miles from Carthage and engaged Joseph in a repentant conversation. Upon arrival in Carthage, Charles privately informed Joseph that there was a conspiracy against his life. Well, this was not new news. The outlaw again, Joseph Jackson, was spotted in Carthage, and he was watched closely by the brethren the entire time they were there. Had there been a show of force by those who supported Joseph, certainly an incident would have happened during this trip to Carthage. Well, no trial was commenced. The material witnesses for the prosecution were absent, and so Joseph went home. And as usual, the rains followed. The last 30 days, the weather had been very uncomfortable. Many were sick. Emma was ill and had been for nearly a month. On June the 6th, the prophet alerted the saints to not use paper currency. Too much of it had been forged. The bank in Nauvoo had been broken into, and several $100,000 of unsigned currency had been taken and forged. Forgery was a common practice in Nauvoo with its many forms of currency. On June the 7th, the first and only edition of the Nauvoo Expositor was published. It was edited by Sylvester Emmons, a non-member, and consisted of 1,000 copies. Its pages contained bombastic lies and demonic inferences. It brought the entire city up in arms. The city council deliberated for 2 days in how to deal with the expositor. On June the 10th, after 14 hours of mature deliberation, the city council passed an ordinance that declared the Nauvoo Expositor a nuisance and instructed the mayor to destroy the press. John P. Green, the city marshal, was then ordered by the mayor, Joseph Smith, to destroy the press with its assistance, if necessary, of the Nauvoo Legion. Well, Marshal Green demanded the keys to the building from Francis Higbee, and he refused, so the door was kicked open. And by 8 p.m., the press, the type, the printed paper, and fixtures had been removed to the street and destroyed. Charles Foster immediately contacted Thomas Sharp of the Warsaw Signal newspaper. I won't go through this, but this particular slide you can read on your own is the letter from Charles Foster to Thomas Sharp of the Warsaw Signal explaining to him what had just taken place. Newspapers in the nearby towns erupted with the news of the destruction of the press, even though Illinois had experienced 20 similar destructions of printing presses over the previous 20 years without hardly even a notice. Well, Thomas Sharp of the Warsaw Signal said, and I quote, "We hold ourselves at all times in readiness to cooperate with our fellow citizens to utterly exterminate the wicked and abominable Mormon leaders." He continued, "War and extermination is inevitable. Citizens, arise, one and all. Can you stand by and suffer such infernal devils? To rob men of their property and rights without avenging them? We have no time for comment. Every man will make his own, and let it be made with powder and ball." Now, the Mormon haters on both sides of the Mississippi sensed a great opportunity to take care of the Mormons once and for all. Governor Ford was pressured to take Joseph into custody. On June the 12th, Joseph and 17 others, namely the city council, were arrested by David Bettesworth on a writ issued by Francis Higbee in Carthage on charges of inciting a riot and the destruction of property. The writ said that he had to appear before a justice in the county. Well, Joseph said he would appear before a Nauvoo judge, and this infuriated the sheriff of Carthage. Nevertheless, Joseph appeared before the Nauvoo municipal court, as did the other members of the city council. After listening to all of the arguments, Joseph and the city council were honorably discharged, and the suit was terminated and thought to be nothing more than malicious, and Francis Higbee was ordered to pay the cost of the suit. On the evening of June 13th, the prophet related a dream that he had recently had, and I'll share that with you. And I quote, "Wherein my guardian angel was walking with me when we spied 2 snakes locked together in battle. The angel told me they were the Higbees and the Fosters, locked together, that they had no power to hurt me. Later I found myself walking alone in the prairie when the laws overtook me and tied up my hands and threw me in a pit. Well, while attempting to escape, I heard Wilson Law cry for help. He was being attacked by ferocious beasts. I said, 'I cannot help you. You've put me in a pit.' I looked the other way, and there was William Law being poisoned by a coiled snake and crying out for help. And I said, 'I am unable to help you. for you put me in a pit. I was then freed by my guardian angel. An ever-increasing number of mobsters continued to gather at Carthage and Warsaw, drafting resolutions against Joseph and the saints. Ammunition and arms arrived in Carthage from Missouri to prepare for a conflict. The people living in Lima, which is an Isaac Morley settlement, were confronted by Levi Williams of the mob, and their weapons were demanded. The prophet told them when they gave up their arms to give up their lives as dearly as possible. On June the 14th, Joseph wrote to Governor Ford and explained the facts concerning the removal of the expositor. On Sunday, June 16th, Joseph preached a strong sermon on the plurality of gods. Now, this subject was being used by the conspirators to show Joseph as a fallen prophet. After the meeting, the prophet expressed the feelings that, quote, all should be ready to defend the city, but to keep cool and make no disturbances. He also sent delegates out to the surrounding cities to show that peace prevailed in Nauvoo. On this slide, you can see that Nauvoo is kind of the hub of a wheel, and the spokes are all of these communities, and many of them having been settled by church members during the course of the Nauvoo period. Joseph received some advice from Judge Jesse B. Thomas to go outside of Nauvoo and be judged relative to the expositor affair. If acquitted, this would allay the excitement and answer the law. On June 17th, Joseph and the city council allowed themselves to be arrested per the advice of Judge Jesse Thomas. They were tried by Justice Daniel H. Wells, a non-Mormon, and after a lengthy examination, they were all discharged. Joseph continued to receive letters from outlying communities of impending attacks by the mob. His counsel was the same: hold your ground and defend yourself, unless retreating to Nauvoo is necessary. Brother Stephen Markin came before Joseph and told him that he had information to indicate that an immediate attack on Nauvoo was coming. Well, Joseph immediately called out the Nauvoo Legion and placed them under the control of John P. Green, the Nauvoo city marshal. Joseph's personal guard and staff were called out and put on alert. On Tuesday, June 18th, at 1:45 p.m., the prophet declared the city of Nauvoo under martial law. At 2 p.m., Joseph, in full dress uniform, delivered his last public sermon on a platform near the mansion house to the Nauvoo Legion, and he said, and I quote, I have unleashed my sword with a firm and unalterable determination that this people shall have their legal rights and be protected from mob rule. God has tried you. You're a good people. Therefore I love you with all my heart. Greater love hath no man than he should lay down his life for his friends. You have stood by me in my hour of trouble, and I am willing to sacrifice my life for your preservation. Well, at this time, the prophet received by messenger numerous reports of threats on his life, some of which had taken place earlier but had been foiled because of the precautions that were in place at this time. Apparently, the governor was not really interested in helping the saints, or for that matter, the mob either. The mob had tried to get an audience with the governor, but was unsuccessful. This caused the mob at one time to say that Governor Ford was as big a scoundrel as Joe Smith. Or was he simply biding his time? On June 19th, the prophet ordered a picket guard on all roads leading out of the city, and an inner guard posted in all streets and alleys. All powder and lead was secured in the city. All arms were distributed to those able to fight. From the best information learned by the prophet, 200 mobsters had gathered at Carthage, 200 at Warsaw, 200 at Rocky Run, and 200 were coming from Missouri. The mob was continuing to threaten the outlying communities unless they joined with them in their assault on Nauvoo. Brothers Allen T. Waite, Hiram B. Mont, John Cunningham, Isaac Morley, Gardner Snow, John Edmondson, Edmund Durfee, Solomon Hancock, William Garner, John Lofton, Obadiah Bowen, and Alva Tibbets all signed affidavits that they were threatened with death if they did not join the mob. These brave saints lived some distance outside of Nauvoo. These and many other sworn testimonies of impending invasions were sent to John Tyler, who was President of the United States at that time. Now, I referenced one individual, Edmund Durfee. And although his story is really after the death of Joseph, I'd like to share that with you at this time. I had the opportunity to work a little bit with the Durfee family in acquiring permission to put a new Durfee headstone in the Pioneer City Cemetery in Nauvoo. It seems that on March 12, 1843, the Lima branch of the church was organized at Yale-Rome. Isaac Morley was sustained as the president, and Edmund Durfee was appointed to the High Council. On September the 10th, 1845, armed Illinois and Missouri ruffians on horseback rode to the home of Edmund Durfee and ordered him and his family outside. They then set fire to his home, his barn, and other buildings. The mob of 100 to 200 men then went on doing the same thing to most of the buildings and homes in town. Brigham Young was informed and rushed with a large team of men to rescue the homeless families. He took them to Nauvoo for protection and care. Now, Edmund and the others had not harvested all their crops there at Yale-Rome, and an agreement was reached with the mob which allowed the men to return and harvest their grain in November. Edmund and the other men returned to harvest their crops. One evening, as the group was housed at the Solomon Hancock home, someone yelled, "Fire!" Looking out of the window, the men saw a haystack in the front yard on fire. As the men were frantically trying to douse the flames, 5 gunshots were heard. And in the confusion that followed, one saint lay dead on the ground, shot through the neck and chest. It was Edmund Durfee. It was later learned that one of the mob had boasted on a bet of a gallon of whiskey that he could kill him on the first shot. It was also learned that this group was led by Levi Williams of the Warsaw Militia, the same Levi Williams who would stand trial for the murder of Joseph and Hiram. Well, I was pleased to have played a small part in this tribute monument that is erected now in the Nauvoo Pioneer Cemetery. On June 20th, Joseph sent a letter to Brigham Young requesting that he and the other political missionaries come home as soon as possible. He said, "The excitement in the city is great indeed. Return without delay." Joseph later that day made a prophecy that no gun would be fired by the saints during this fuss. Joseph tried to persuade Hiram to leave with his family and go to Cincinnati out of harm's way, and Hiram's response was, "Joseph, I cannot leave you." On June 21st, Governor Ford finally decided to make a showing in Carthage and stem the tide of civil disturbance. He requested a representative who could explain the case in question be sent to Carthage from Nauvoo. Lucius Woodworth, Dr. John M. Bernheisel, and John Taylor were asked by the city council to go. The group carried many sworn statements about the conduct of the mob, as well as a letter to the governor asking him to come to Nauvoo and investigate further. It seems the representatives of Nauvoo were given no chance to explain their position, but were harassed on every front and treated rudely. The governor was surrounded during the interview by the Laws, the Fosters, the Higbees, and Joseph Jackson and his cronies. Apparently, Governor Ford had made up his mind before the prophet's representatives ever even arrived. On June 22nd, Joseph received a communication from the governor charging him with the abuse of power in the destruction of the printing press, instigating martial law, and the illegal use of the municipal courts. He said, quote, "I will guarantee the safety of all such persons as may be brought to this place from Nauvoo, either for trial or as a witness for the accused." Well, in answer to Governor Ford's letter, Joseph pleaded to have him to come to Nauvoo to hear the rest of the story. Joseph said, "We dare not come. You cannot control the mob, for our lives would be in danger, and we are not guilty of no crime." Well, later that night, the prophet met with the group and reviewed the governor's letter. Joseph commented, "There is no mercy here, Hiram. What shall we do?" All of a sudden, Joseph's countenance brightened, and he said, and I quote, "The way is open. It is clear in my mind what we shall do. All they want is Hiram and myself. Then tell everybody to go about their business and not to collect in groups, but to scatter about. There is no doubt that they will come here to search for us. Let them search. They will not harm you in any person or property, and not even a hair of your head. We will cross the river tonight and go away to the west." Shortly after coming to this conclusion, the prophet made this last statement recorded in his personal journal. "I told Stephen Markin that if I and Hiram were ever taken again, we should be massacred, or I was not a prophet of God." At 9 p.m., Joseph and Hiram left their tearful families and with Willard Richards and Orrin Porter Rockwell headed to the Mississippi. They borrowed Aaron Johnson's skiff. Orrin rowed. The skiff leaked badly and required Joseph, Hiram, and Willard to use their boots to bail water to prevent it from sinking. They reached the Iowa side about midnight, and Joseph told Orrin to return to Nauvoo and bring back horses the next night and be ready to start for the Rocky Mountains. Early the next morning, June 23rd, a posse did arrive in Nauvoo to arrest Joseph. Not finding him, they returned to Carthage. In the meantime, the brethren were readying themselves at the home of William Jordan for the horseback ride west. At 1 p.m., Emma sent Orrin Porter Rockwell and Reynolds Cahoon back to Joseph with a letter to try to entreat him to return to Nauvoo. Reynolds found the brethren packing and informed Joseph that the troops were not going to leave Nauvoo until he returned, and reminded Joseph of Governor's promise of protection. Reynolds Cahoon, Lorenzo Wasson, and Hiram Kimball kind of indirectly accused Joseph of abandoning his flock. To this Joseph replied, "Well, if my life is of no value to my friends, it is of none to myself." He then turned to Rockwell and said, "What shall I do?" Rockwell replied, "You're the oldest, and you ought to know what is best, and as you make your bed, I will lie with you." He then turned and asked the same question to Hiram. His response was, "Let us go back and give ourselves up and see the thing out." Joseph then studied the thing for a moment and said, "If you go back, I will go with you, but we will be butchered." Hiram then said, No, let us go back and put our trust in the Lord, and we will not be harmed." Well, as great a man as Hiram was, there could only be one prophet speaking the will of the Lord, and he had spoken. Joseph then wrote a letter to Governor Ford telling him he would surrender on the morrow, requesting a posse to accompany him to Carthage. The governor refused to send the posse to escort and protect Joseph and his party. On June 24th, at 6:15 in the morning, Joseph and the group of about 30 started for Carthage. Joseph paused at the temple and remarked, "This is the loveliest place and the best people under heaven. Little do they know the trials that await them." The company called upon Judge Daniel H. Wells, just out of town, who was a good friend of the Mormons, and Joseph said, "Squire Wells, I wish you to cherish my memory, and not think me the worst man in the world either." At 9:50 a.m., the group was met 4 miles outside of Carthage at the home of Albert Fellows by Captain Dunn of the Illinois militia. He and his 60 mounted militia were headed to Nauvoo to take possession of the arms of the Nauvoo Legion. Dunn requested that Joseph and the company return to Nauvoo with him to assist in the collection of the arms. It was while at Fellows' farm that Joseph made the infamous statement, "I am going like a lamb to the slaughter, but I am as calm as the summer's morn." Joseph then sent 2 letters, one to Governor Ford explaining his delay, and the other to Major General Dunham of the Nauvoo Legion ordering him to comply strictly with the order issued by Governor Ford. Joseph arrived back in about 2:15 in the afternoon in Nauvoo. By 6 p.m., all the Legion's arms had been collected at the mansion hall. Joseph took the opportunity to write home twice to Emma and his children to bid them final farewell. Joseph counseled Emma emphatically both times, "Please raise our children in the Lord." The company of 15 with Joseph then rode out of town. As Joseph passed his farm, he paused. When asked by some of the company why he was delaying the trip, he said, quote, "If some of you had got such a farm and knew you would not see it any more, you would want to take a good look at it for the last time." Well, at the fellow's farm outside of Carthage, the group again was met by Captain Dunn, who was returning with the arms from Nauvoo. He then escorted the group into Carthage at 11:55 p.m. The company went immediately to the Hamilton House, and amidst the devilish cries of the Carthage Grey militia that were waiting for his arrival, Governor Ford calmed them down by promising to parade the prophet the following morning in front of the troops. The next morning, June 25th, Joseph and the others surrendered themselves to Constable David Bettesworth on a riot charge and the destruction of the expositor. Joseph's defense counsel would be H.T. Reed and James W. Wood. The brethren were surprised, in fact shocked, when Joseph and Hiram were arrested a second time at 8 o'clock in the morning on a writ issued by Augustine Spencer before the Mormon hater, Judge Robert R. Smith, this time for treason against the state of Illinois in putting the city of Nauvoo under martial law and calling out the Nauvoo Legion. This was an unbailable offense, keeping Joseph in Carthage. At 9:53 in the morning, Joseph and Hiram and a number of the other brethren were paraded in front of the troops. They were introduced about 20 times as General Smith and Hiram Smith. When they were introduced to the Carthage Greys, the militia threw their hats into the air and threatened to introduce themselves in a different manner and drew their swords. About this time also, the Warsaw troops entered Carthage to participate in the insults on the group. And finally, Joseph returned to the Hamilton House, and he wrote a letter to Emma, telling her he thought that the governor would keep the peace and that law would prevail. He also asked Orem Porter Rockwell, "Do not come to Carthage, or you will be taken prisoner." Okay, that kind of concludes where we want to stop now, and I'm sure you can surmise that our next podcast will be all about Joseph's days in jail there in Carthage. We'll pretty much conclude our series entitled Passport to Heaven. So thank you for joining me today. I hope you found this an interesting podcast. I certainly look forward to seeing you again.